Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today I'm going to do something for the spirit of the season because this video is being uploaded the day before Easter 2022. Now I'm still going to talk about a fantasy story, but I'm going to talk about Tolkien, and there's a reason for that. It's because, well, right now, the new show coming out that is supposed to be for Tolkien fans is actually enraging a lot of Tolkien fans. That show being The Rings of Power, which trailer is becoming staggeringly downvoted. Last time I saw it reported, it was downvoted to 3 million. And I'm also doing this because I listened to a very small channel, very small podcast where they were talking about the Rings of Power and the show and fans of Tolkien. And they said something that really struck me. They said, there's not much we as the fans can do about this, except to continue to be fans of the original Tolkien work and to show our appreciation and love for that original work. Because the show is really taking Tolkien himself and throwing him out the window. They don't care. They state it. They don't care what Tolkien would have thought. They're just using his characters and his world to sell their own story. So in part, I'm doing this because I'm someone who very much appreciates the work of Tolkien. Although I haven't read every last thing, I haven't gone through all of his letters, I haven't gone through every last inch of what he has written, I have lived with him in my household since I was a boy. And really, that gives me very much an appreciation for his work. And really an appreciation for what he was trying to do. And I want to express that appreciation as part of a defense of Tolkien by the fans to show that this is the actual legacy of Tolkien and not anything that's going to come out that ignores what he actually meant. And I'm also doing this because, again, it's the day before Easter. And Tolkien himself was a very devout man. And his story was a story about his Christian religion that he wanted to pass on to his children. There is no way around that. And so, for those of you who don't particularly like this vein of thought or argumentation, yes, I'm going to go a lot into an argument based upon Christian principles that I would say Tolkien himself would have argued from. And I'm doing this on the topic that I usually talk about, the topic of hero. Because Tolkien's hero, his heroes really, which would be Bilbo and Frodo, although I think Bilbo gets lost at this point. He seems to be nothing more than a proto-version of Frodo. But at the same time, his heroes for his stories are very unique among what you see today. And so I want to go over the nature of the Tolkien hero and talk about where I think this originates from. And again, as I always do, I'm presenting you an argument. I don't know this for sure. I'm taking facts from what I know. And again, I don't know everything about Tolkien, but I'm looking at the larger principles behind what he's trying to express, what he's trying to say in the things that I do know, and use that to extract, or at the very least argue that this is what he was extracting in order to write a traditional and true hero. And for me, quite honestly, the hero of Tolkien is based upon a very old idea. It's based upon the ideas of Augustine of Hippo. And is there a tie between Tolkien and Augustine of Hippo? Well, yes, there is. Besides the fact that the Christianity that Tolkien himself practiced, he was a Roman Catholic, and for all Christians, really, I would say, or the majority of Christians anyways, Augustine looms large. He is one of the greatest theologians, and that continues also within the Catholic Church, and certainly within the Catholic Church that Tolkien himself was a part of. But he does have a more direct connection than that. Tolkien's mother died early on in his life, and he went to live in an oratory, and the person who was given care of him was a priest. And this oratory was set up by one of the greatest thinkers of the 18th century of the Catholic Church, which would be John Henry Newman. And the man who took over as Tolkien's guardian and who ran the oratory at that time was Newman's good friend and was continuing on the work that was set up by Newman in that oratory after Newman had died. And the thing being that John Henry Newman himself was a great admirer of Augustine of Hippo. In his works, in his many writings, he shows this very plainly. He himself, in the 1830s, was talking about a coming conflict of the city of God and the city of man that he saw brewing. And it was that conflict that was to emerge in the early 1900s of the First and Second World War that Tolkien himself had to live through, that he fought in the First World War, and that his son fought in the Second World War. And Tolkien himself, in some of his letters, when he's talking to his son, when his son is fighting in the Second World War, he said, I know you're going to try to crystallize things down in your mind. What is good? What is evil? What is fair? Where do all these things come from? How can I define them to understand what is going on around me? And Tolkien himself said, when I did that, when I was in the trenches, I came up with the idea of Morgoth. And as Tolkien states in other of his letters, in other of his recordings, Morgoth is the devil. And so it is not a large stretch of the imagination to see how this looming figure of Augustine in the oratory and in the good friend of John Henry Newman, who brought up Tolkien after his mother's death, impressed upon him these Augustinian ideas to a great degree. And indeed, there have been many writers and many thinkers who have taken the ideas of Augustine and applied them to Tolkien's work, and shown how the greatest idea of Augustine, the idea of a city of man versus a city of God, is indeed what you can break down Tolkien's stories into. Now, I don't have the time nor the inclination right now in order to go over all of those arguments that other people have presented, to show the connection between Augustine's City of God and City of Man and Tolkien's work. What I'm going to do is take a very specific passage from the City of God, which is Augustine's work, where he describes his hero, and then apply that to the hero of Tolkien. Now, if you've ever read Augustine's City of God, you would probably know that Augustine's hero is St. Paul. Now, certainly the hero of any Christian is supposed to be Christ, and it is Christ, but St. Paul, as all saints, is someone who had put on Christ, and so he is the continuation, just like all saints were and are, the continuation of the life of Christ upon the earth. And Augustine, being a Gentile, looks towards the disciple of the Gentiles, which is St. Paul, and talks about him in a heroic fashion. And this is not foreign to the works of St. Paul that are in the Bible, because St. Paul often talks about running the race. He talks about putting on the armor of light. And so the Christian life as a heroic life. And so, as I said, I'm going to take that passage about St. Paul that Augustine wrote in the City of God, in the quintessential chapter of his quintessential book, and compare that with Tolkien's heroes of Frodo and Bilbo and the world in which they inhabit. But before I even get there, I just want to note that I don't know if there's any primary sources that I could think of off the top of my head, but it is tradition that St. Paul was a short, stocky man. And to me, when I think of St. Paul, I do think of a hobbit-like individual. He was a very simple, short and stocky man, and he himself is someone who crisscrossed the known world, bringing the message of Christianity as far and wide as he could carry it. And this, I would say, plays right into the idea of Tolkien's great journeys, both of Bilbo and of Frodo. But to read you the passage, little by little, it's only fairly short, but it starts like this. That hero, I say, and athlete of Christ, instructed by him, anointed of his Spirit, crucified with him, glorious in him, lawfully maintaining a great conflict in the theatre of this world, and being made a spectacle to angels and men. So I can stop there, because there is a mouthful right there. This is Augustine describing a hero of Christ. This is Augustine describing St. Paul. Now, in that first part, it's many qualifiers talking about how St. Paul himself described himself. And so this is how we know it's St. Paul. These are quotes over and over again from the letters of St. Paul. But it begins, that athlete of Christ. And that, again, is a very important way of looking at St. Paul, and I think both Frodo and Bilbo. Why? Because, again, you have this short, stocky man who thinks himself an athlete, who talks about running the race, and not just running the race, but coming first, winning the race. And in his letters, again, he talks about this. And if you were looking at the man as he actually said this thing, this short, stocky man, you would probably think to yourself, you're the last one who's probably going to win this race. But indeed, he is. Just like you would look at both Bilbo and Frodo and say to yourself, well, let's say you were someone who had never heard of Tolkien before, you had picked up these books when they originally came out, and you started reading them. Would you really have thought that Bilbo and Frodo were the heroes of this story without knowing anything about it? No, you probably wouldn't. You wouldn't have thought these two people were the heroes of these stories. You might say to yourself, they're the storyteller. They're the ones telling the story of these heroes that they are joining. But no, they're the hero. Again, looking at them saying this little, short, stocky person is not what is going to be the hero, is not the one that's going to carry on, is not the one that's going to win the race in the end. But they are. Because, in some fashion, this race is a marathon. This race is the crisscrossing of St. Paul over the known world. This is the journey of Bilbo and Frodo as they stretch across their known world and get to the end where no one else has gotten to. And so you'll note right at the beginning, he's the athlete of Christ. That is to say, he follows the truth that is greater than himself. He serves. He is not someone who is the master. He is the servant. And again, this is a prefigurement, I would say, of the heroic nature of both Bilbo and Frodo. And then he goes on to talk about the descriptors of St. Paul, usually from the mouth of St. Paul himself, when he says, anointed of his spirit, crucified with him, glorious in him. These are a lot of the statements that St. Paul himself makes. I think most of them are from Galatians, actually, where St. Paul talks about having crucified my flesh with that of Christ. So again, these are descriptors that, yes, this is St. Paul that he is describing. And again, it ends glorious in him. That is to say, he does not glory in himself. He glories in Christ. And again, as I said, I would see this as being the nature of both Bilbo and Frodo. They don't glory in themselves. Their simple nature is what actually carries them through to the end. But he goes on to say, lawfully maintaining a great conflict in the theater of this world and being made a spectacle to angels and men. Now, this simple statement, lawfully maintaining a great conflict, I think is very telling. Once again, it shows that even when you are in a conflict, even when you are fighting for your life, you must do so in a lawful manner. That is to say, you cannot fight evil with evil. You must fight evil with good. And this is the reason why Bilbo and Frodo are actually able to carry on with their mission. Everyone else, certainly around Frodo, everyone else thinks to themselves at some point, if I could just use the power of this ring, I could defeat the evil that is surmounting within the world. They all think to themselves at one point, I could use this evil for good. But no, that is not the case. It will never actually happen. They will be twisted to the will of evil if they try to do that, except for your simple hobbits who don't think about power. Again, lawfully maintaining. That is to say, you fight evil with good. And that last line, being made a spectacle to angels and men. Now, spectacle, that is a very simple word, but it is something which is very telling, because prior to that, he talks about the theater of this world. And if you go back to ancient times, when they talk about theater, what do they talk about? It is the spectacle that you are watching. Again, as I have noted many times, when Aristotle talks about the plays that he is discussing within his works, he talks about the spectacle. That's what you see up there on the stage. And so it is the spectacle in this theater of the world, which St. Paul is to both angels and men. And so it is with Bilbo and Frodo, especially Frodo, because again, no one would see these simple creatures, these simple hobbits, as being the center of everything that this story is revolving around. But they are. Or, I suppose, a better way to put it is, they're not really the center of everything, but they are the spectacle. It is them that drive the spectacle because of their simple nature and the following of the truth, and their attachment to what is good rather than what is evil. As St. Paul became a spectacle to the men around him and to the angels that guided him, so it is with Bilbo and Frodo. You have the men, all the men of the world, fighting for what they see to be possibly the end of their civilizations. And yet it is this hobbit that is the center of the spectacle. And again, angels, if you look at Tolkien's mythology, that is what Gandalf is. That is what a wizard is in his world. They are second-level angels. And even these angels themselves are simply witnesses, to some extent, of this spectacle that is centered around these simple creatures of hobbits. And Augustine goes on to say, and pressing onward for the prize of his high calling. Again, talking about St. Paul, pressing onward in his constant journey for the calling that was given to him that he did not give to himself. And once again, this is a parallel with Frodo and Bilbo, because that's what they do. They press on in their journey, a journey which they themselves would never have taken unless they were called to do so. And then he goes on to say, very joyfully do we with the eyes of faith behold him rejoicing with them that rejoice, and weeping with them that weep, though hampered by fightings without and fears within. Now this passage itself is a connection to everything that Augustine is saying within this entire book. It is a culmination of what he is talking about when he talks about the will, because what he's talking about is a city of God versus a city of man. And the difference between those two cities is the love behind them. Is it a good will behind them, or is it an evil will? That is to say, do you place your love on what is good, or do you place your love on what is evil? Because he's arguing against, mostly, the sect of thinkers which he used to be a part of, which was the Stoics, saying that before this and in the rest of the book, for the Stoics, some emotions are actually bad. Sorrow, for the Stoics, is something that should never be there in your life. But Augustine says, for the Christian, this is not the case. Every emotion is good, or to put it another way, every emotion can be good or can be evil. It depends on the will behind those emotions. So, desire, joy, fear, even hatred, these are all good emotions as long as there is a good will behind them. It's not just joy, but yes, fear itself is a good emotion as long as there is a good will behind it. Again, will being what you place your love on. What is fear? For Augustine, how does he define it? He defines it as moving away from something you do not wish to happen. And when you look at it in those terms, you say, yeah, I'm moving away from this thing because I know it's going to hurt me. That's fear. It's a good fear because I know it's going to hurt me. I know in reality it's going to hurt me. It's going to cause me pain and suffering. And suffering itself is just movement away from that pain which has already happened to you. So yeah, there's a good fear because you're moving away from something that's going to hurt you. And so there is also a good hatred. The idea of loving the sinner and hating the sin, this is summed up in Augustine, where he says that a citizen of the city of God must have towards sinners a perfect hatred. That is to say, to love the man and hate the sin. Because if you do so, all that ought to be loved, which is the man, will be loved, and all that ought to be hated, which is the vice, will be cursed. This idea itself comes out within Tolkien's work, when they learn that Gollum is following them, when Gandalf tells Frodo that he is behind them and he is following them. Frodo does, for a second, reach for power. He thinks that Bilbo should have killed Gollum, and why didn't he? And that's an expression of, why can't we just kill him now? And what is the answer to that? What does Gandalf say, this second-tier angel? He says, it's not your place to deal out death and judgment. Why? Because even Gollum himself can be redeemed. That is to say, you must again love the sinner and hate the sin. And he talks about the corruption that has gone on within the life of Gollum. And this idea itself, the idea of loving the sinner but hating the sin, is one of the central themes of John Henry Newman's work. John Henry Newman being the person who started the oratory, the great friend of the person who brought Tolkien up after his mother died. And it is a theme that was taken up by men like Fulton Sheen a century later with his plea for intolerance. What was this plea for intolerance about? And again, I'm saying intolerance, a plea for intolerance. It was to be intolerant of lies. It was to be intolerant of what is not true. Because it was Newman who said in the 1830s that there was a great conflict between these two cities, and it was going to emerge in the next century because of this tolerance of the untrue. And again, this is extremely poignant to what we have to deal with today, with these people telling us that we must tolerate everything. No, we must have a new plea for intolerance, an intolerance of what is a lie, an intolerance of what is an untruth. And through all these men, I do believe, and other greater thinkers than me have stated this outright, that this is one of the central themes of Tolkien's work. And this is really what the heroism of Frodo is about. Because you see, Morgoth, who is the origin of evil, Morgoth is the devil. Morgoth is he who covets power. And what does he do? That being who is given more than any other, and yet it was not enough for him. He wanted more. He constantly wanted more power. And what does he do with that power when he takes it unto himself? He builds himself a city. A city devoted to him and his lust for power, and that is opposed to that city of light that was constructed before his. But the point being within Tolkien's mythology is that Morgoth is bound at the end of the First Age. So who then steps in as the embodiment of evil within the world? Well, of course, that's Sauron. But here's the thing. Sauron is defeated with the destruction of the ring. And so because of that, the two physical manifestations of evil in the world, first being Morgoth and then being Sauron, are gone within the world. But as Tolkien says within the description of his mythology, their evil still lingers. And how does this evil linger? Well, it lingers in lies and falsehoods that continues on in the world, corrupting what is good. And that's why Frodo is the hero that he is, because he's a prefigurement of the man that was to come, or the type of man that was to come and to live in the world after the destruction of the One Ring. Because before that time, there was a lust for power that could have a physical manifestation within the world. But after that time, the physical manifestation was not there. There was simply the lies and falsehoods that was to eat away and corrupt at the souls of men. But that's what we see within Frodo, because Frodo and Bilbo before him, they're not corrupted by power. They are, through their lives and what they do and how they live, very simple. They don't care about power. And it is because they don't care about power, they can't be corrupted in the same way that all the rest of the people around them can be corrupted by this physical evil. They can only be corrupted by those lies, by those falsehoods. And that's why we see within the later books of Tolkien and within the end of the journey of Frodo itself, it is the corruption of the lies and falsehoods that finally get to him and finally make him think for a moment that he should have the ring. You see, he is the prefigurement of all the men that are to come after him, because all must struggle like him in the time after, where there is no physical manifestation of evil. There is the evil of lies and deception that will eat away at men's souls, and they must, like he in his journey, fight against it in the way that he fought against it, in the way that Bilbo fought against it, in that simple advice that Gandalf gave to him when they were beginning their journey, when he didn't know what he was going to do and if he could actually make it through this journey. Gandalf said to him, when the heart needs lifting, think of simple things. And that's what Bilbo does. He thinks of simple things. It is the simple that is to carry them through beyond the lies and the deception that wishes to corrupt men within the world. And that indeed is what Augustine is talking about when he says, hampered by fightings without and fears within. And so we see both Bilbo and Frodo, they go through battles, but it is not the battle and it is not these great wars that is actually going to, in the end, determine what is going to happen. It is their fears and how they deal with their fears. Is it a good will? Is it an evil will that drives it? And through this, will they show the other men of Middle-earth? And again, Middle-earth, many say, because of course it is midway between the city of man and the city of God, when you act in this way. Will he show the men of Middle-earth how to actually deal with evil? Not through the lust of power, not through the idea of, if I just had that power, things would be better. No, it's through the simple things. It is through humility. And a humility based on what? Well, the very next line for Augustine is, desiring to depart and to be with Christ. That is to say, to attach yourself to what is true. Because within the Christian religion, Christ himself is the truth. He says, I am the truth. And although I wish I could go over the next passage in all its glory, I'm just going to read it out and deal with one little part of it. He continues on by saying, desiring to depart and to be with Christ, longing to see the Romans, that he might have some fruit among them as among the other Gentiles, being jealous over the Corinthians, and fearing in that jealousy lest their mind should be corrupted from the simplicity that is in Christ, having great heaviness and continual sorrow of heart for the Israelites, because they, being ignorant of God's righteousness, and going about to establish their own righteousness, have not submitted themselves unto the righteousness of God. And expressing not only his sorrow, but bitter lamentations over some who had formerly sinned, and had not repented of their uncleanness and fornications. Again, we see a call to simplicity. Here he talks about the simplicity that is in Christ. How? By making sure that you're not self-righteous, by submitting yourself to the righteousness of the truth, the righteousness of God. And then he goes on to bookend this talk about heroes by talking about virtue, and saying, if these emotions and affections, arising as they do from the love of what is good and from a holy charity, are to be called vices, then let us allow these emotions which are truly vices to pass under the name of virtues. But since these affections, when they are exercised in a becoming way, follow the guidance of right reason, who will dare to say that they are diseases or vicious passions? And here we see what I would say is a very keen connection to all ages, and our age as well, as to what is going on around us. We see people around us calling good evil and evil good, calling virtues vice and vices virtues. And how does he say that we should know actual virtue as actual virtue and actual vice as actual vice? Well, again, it all comes back to what I've been saying many a times within many a videos. It's right reason. That is to say, your reason shaped by what is real. As he and many other of these great thinkers finally break it down to. It is only through right reason that you can be allowed to name these virtues, and then your emotions and your affections can arise from a love of what is good and a holy charity. And again, so it is we see within the journey of Bilbo, thinking about simple things. So it is we see within the journey of Frodo, although it is within the person of Samwise, where he looks up at that star when he is in the midst of evil, and looking up at that twinkling star, thinking to himself, there is something beautiful, there is something good, which evil cannot touch. It is through the contemplation of the simple things of reality, understanding them, and then bringing that understanding to bear in order to see what is true virtue, in order to understand, and more than that, love what is good. It is through these, and with these simple things, that Bilbo and Sam and Frodo and St. Paul and St. Augustine and you and I can live that life of virtue in the love of what is good by cutting through the lies and deceptions that surround us in this world. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all these things. All right, I'll see you later. And a happy Easter to everyone. Bye.